Hello, everyone. Here is Tatiana Bazzichelli from the Disruption Network Lab. And I'm very happy to introduce our 35th conference, Shadows of Illiberalism, Resisting the Radical Right. We are connected at the Kunstquartier Bethanien in Berlin, and we are both on streaming and also with the people here in a great venue, actually, that gave us hospitality since 11 years now. And we have to say that in all of these 11 years, a lot of things happened, both in Berlin, in Europe, in the world. Recently, we have been seeing all the news also coming from the riots in Los Angeles, from what is happening of the rise of illiberalism in Europe and Eastern Europe, what is happening in Gaza. So there is really a lot to speak about. Yesterday, we had also very deep conversations about that with Franco Berardi and Yasmin Daher. We spoke also a lot about forms of resistance that could relate with the discourse of solidarity as well. And today, we are also exploring the roots of the far right and trying to understand how we could challenge its influence through art, activism, and technology, but mostly also how to understand this phenomenon. And it was very interesting that yesterday another things that came out was the fact of trying to create resistance by understanding and imagining that the discourse of understanding is already an act of resistance. So we will start today with that, with going to the roots and the genesis of the new right. We will also understand why it's called the new right. We will touch the discourse of anti-gender politics and understand also how this new right is creating systems of oppression worldwide. So we start with first of all, a keynote with Florian Kramen and Katri Jacobs, and then we will go on with a performance, lecture performance by Donatella Deraratta that is focusing on generative AI through the violence of the not yet realized. And we will see sceneries from Palestine to Trump's America. And after that, there will be a panel connecting the discourse indeed of generative AI, the weaponization of language, and also shadow campaigns. So, since also for us is a struggle as Disruption Network Lab, because you can imagine 11 years of these topics is quite a challenge. I have to say that still I'm happy that we have another year of survival and hopefully more than that. And I want to thank our funders, the Hauptstadtkulturfonds, that is the Capital Culture Funds of Berlin, the Riva and David Logan Foundation, and we are also working part of New Perspective of Action, a project by Reimagine Europe, co-funded by the European Union. Then, of course, I want to thank our audience, both the one that is here in Berlin today and the one that is online. And the audience online is following also through a chat that we have active. So I want to remind the people that are listening that they can ask questions to our speakers. So during the panels and the keynote, we will call them to interact in our sessions. So also be ready to ask questions. And in that frame, I want to thank also our streaming partner, Boiling Head Media, that are running the streaming, and they have been doing here at the Disruption Lab since a very long time. And we start then today with the keynote that has the title, The New Rights Culture Hegemony and Contradiction. So we will discuss what is this new right, where it comes from, and also how it's acquiring cultural and political hegemony. And at the same time, how can we dismantle the paradigm by highlighting its contradiction? Also, contradiction that we will see are taking many forms. So will be a very interesting journey that goes from a beginning of transgression through a presence of oppression that also takes different realms, as we will see, touching, as I say, also the discourse of anti-gender politics. And at the end, I don't know if we will go there, but we try. I would like also to imagine what are the forms of resistance that we could collectively create, and is even possible to create a resistance towards the rights, towards the extreme rights or the new rights. So now I want to introduce more in depth our keynotes. We will have first Florian Kramer coming here on stage with this presentation, and then Katrin Jacobs, and then we will be all together here for our conversation and the conversation with the audience. So I put my glasses because time is running also for me. So happy to introduce Florian Kramer, or better, Hu Ming. This is his Taiwanese name. Florian Kramer is a practice-based oriented research professor in artistic research and emerging forms of cultural production. Welcome. At the Willem de Kooning Academy in Rotterdam. He's a supervisor in the doctorate Arts plus Creative program, as well as a PhD co-supervisor at Leiden University and the University of Amsterdam. Florian is also a writer on arts, information technology, and subculture since the 1990s, and zine maker since 1982. I think this is very important to say about him. He is an associate member of the Pearl River Delta-based Display Distribute Collective, which proposed the concept of semi-autonomous zines in East and Southeast Asia. Then I want to introduce Katrin, that will follow Florian. Katrin Jacobs is associate professor in digital media and communication at Monash University of Malaysia. She's a research associate at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and the University of Ghent. She has lectured and published widely about sexuality, gender, and digital media, contemporary arts and activism in Chinese society and the EU. In 2022, she published Tit for Tat Media, The Contention Bodies and Sex Imagery on Political Activism. She's preparing a new book and artwork about deep fakes and AI bodies that is also part of her presentation today. So now I leave the stage to Florian, and welcome here.
Thanks a lot, Tatiana. Thanks a lot, Disruption Network Lab, for having me here. And what I do is, as you see in my title, I'm allowing myself to take a riff on the title. And actually, I want to look at liberalism and its American variant of libertarianism as a source of contemporary fascism, which might sound counterintuitive, but I should say there are also other publications on this subject. Very recently, Hayek's Bastards by Quinn Slobodian in 2025, just came out a few months ago, and then also 15 years ago by Ishai Landa, The Apprentice's Sorcerers, which is also a historical look into the connections between liberalism, neoliberalism, and the extreme right. But I'm starting, by a quote by, Peter Thiel, if I pronounce him in an American, or Peter Thiel, if I pronounce his original German name, to frame my narrative. He might be known to many of you as a billionaire Silicon Valley entrepreneur. He was a co-founder of PayPal with Elon Musk. He was the founder of Palantir, another artificial intelligence big data startup that works for police agencies and other law enforcement agencies. He was a major Trump supporter, and he was, perhaps most importantly, the early mentor of J.D. Vance, who also introduced Vance to Trump and basically made him vice president, and a person who has financed the neo-reactionary blogger Curtis Yarvin at the same time since more than 10 years. Maybe the name Curtis Yarvin or Moltbach is known to some people here as an influential person on the extreme right. What I'm showing here is a quote, an endorsement for a book by of him, by Peter Thiel, for a book by Alain de Benoist. Alain de Benoist is the notorious founder of the so-called Nouvelle Droite, or New Right, in the late 1960s in France. It could be best characterized as an attempt by the Western European intellectual extreme right to reinvent fascism in a tactics of copying or emulating the ways in which the 1968 leftist student movement had reinvented socialism. Yeah, they saw the necessity of basically coming up with a rebranding or a new version of the extreme right. And what the Nouvelle Droite had mostly studied and appropriated was the concept of the Italian Communist Party leader and theoretician Antonio Gramsci, of gaining cultural hegemony in society as a political tactic. And that was basically taken over by the Nouvelle Droite. The explicit project of the Nouvelle Droite was to gain cultural hegemony for the extreme right. And it could be argued that this project, which was started actually in the year when I was born, 56 years ago, that now in the 2020s, it has finally arrived or succeeded. But maybe in different ways than even Benoist and the original French Nouvelle Droite had imagined. I'm making some links here, also taking the German situation into account. So some of you might be familiar with the German extreme right strategist Götz Kubitschek, who has also a very prominent role for the AfD party, particular its explicitly extreme right wing around Björn Höcke, who is actually, you could say, a pupil of Kubitschek. Kubitschek is basically coming from de Benoist. He has translated his ideology into the German context and was also preceded in the German language area by Armin Mohler, an originally Swiss, then mostly German active theoretician of the so-called conservative revolution, which was another attempt at rebranding the extreme right. In the USA, we have the so-called alt-right that emerged in the 2010s, which explicitly defined itself as part of the identitarian movement, which you could say the identitarian movement was the younger generation activist outcome of the new right, of the Nouvelle Droite. And the founder and chief ideologist of the American alt-right, Richard Spencer, also invited Alain de Benoist to one of the conferences he organized. So there's not just virtual links, but there's direct personal links between all these players. When I said that the New Right cultural hegemony project might have finally succeeded, but in different ways than imagined by its strategists Mohler, Benoist, and Kubitschek, then I think it's because of the convergence of the European-born Nouvelle Droite or New Right with US-American libertarianism, and that needs some explanation. The first problem is libertarian is originally a term that comes from political anarchism, so it is quite confusing. I've witnessed it myself in the 1990s that very often in Europe, American libertarians were mistaken for anarchists. For example, in the open source movements and other counterculture movements. What is called libertarian in America would be called radical free market liberalism in Europe. This also has to do with the fact that the word liberal is understood differently in the USA, namely as synonymous with center-left, the Democratic Party, or what would be called social democratic here in Europe. While in Europe, the meaning of liberal and the classical liberal parties, such as the FDP here in Germany, would be that of moderate libertarian in America. I hope I make sense, and it's a little bit unwrapping of this kind of cross-continental linguistic confusion. so what happened, actually even Richard Spencer himself was a libertarian and a libertarian activist before he became alt-right. The same for Peter Thiel, a libertarian, even a self-confessed libertarian who turned to the extreme right. The same for Curtis Yarvin, the same for Elon Musk. We do have some parallels also in Europe if you look at a number of European liberal parties that also turned to the extreme right since the 1980s. The first was the FPÖ in Austria under Jörg Haider, then the Hungarian Fidesz party of Viktor Orban, and also where I come from, the Dutch party of the former liberal politician Geert Wilders. Geert Wilders was really a veteran liberal politician before he founded his own extreme right party. And it's also partly true for the German AfD, whose original founders were neoliberal professors of economics, and whose current party leader, Alice Weidel, is an economic neoliberal and former Goldman Sachs employee. In the second Trump administration, with its strong influence and presence of right-wing Silicon Valley libertarians such as Thiel and Elon Musk, we see the completion of this convergence of the new right and libertarianism. And it's what we see is a concept that has been called by Benoist and the Nouvelle Droite metapolitics. The idea that politics is done through cultural wars. And you see that articulated in many different ways. For example, the famous quote by Andrew Breitbart, the founder of Breitbart News, which was a really influential alt-right news medium, particularly in the first Trump campaign of 2016, who said, politics is downstream from culture. That's basically the translation of the Nouvelle Droite Benoist program into American politics. And Armin Mohler, whom I already mentioned as the kind of German language counterpart to Benoist, said the same, and he said, intellect rules the world. You win political wars through winning wars of ideas. And yeah, this is what they called metapolitics. And in the Silicon Valley techno-libertarian milieu, we get a new variation on this, or a new riff on this, namely, this is what Peter Thiel said in 2010, technology is this incredible alternative to politics. Yeah? So the idea actually through that you can exercise political power and change political discourse through technology. And we have seen the implementation of this, among others, in the Doge ministry led by Elon Musk. However, what Thiel does not acknowledge is that conversely, technology is politically shaped and influenced. The most striking example, I think, is present-day machine learning, artificial intelligence, which, as most of you probably know, is based on so-called artificial neural network technology, which was invented in the 1950s, along with the concept or the term artificial intelligence. And the inventor of the first neural network of the so-called perceptron, Frank Rosenblatt, was actually inspired in his technical design by the classical neoliberal libertarian free market economist Friedrich Hayek and his concept of spontaneous order. So actually, the roots of present-day AI technology, of machine learning technology, were inspired by the neoliberal economic concept of spontaneous order and basically self-organization, free market self-organization. I think I would like to write a whole history of spontaneous order and how it also links to, for example, indeterministic music composition, early media art, cybernetics, system theory, the beginning of artificial intelligence, economic neoliberalism, and libertarianism. I don't have the time for this. It's just a little footnote, sorry. What we instead see today is, in the libertarian new right, a kind of falsification of a basic hypothesis of political liberalism. And that basic hypothesis is in perhaps, in the book you see on the left, perhaps the most famous philosophical work of political liberalism, The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper, which has the fundamental idea that there is something like an equation of a liberal capitalist market economy and an open society, a liberal society, that you cannot have the one without the other. Yeah? So in order to have functioning market economy, you need free and open society. Yeah? Open society also in the sense, for example, of open borders. Yeah? That's a more progressive liberal concept. And of course, economic globalization. Yeah? That comes from this kind of philosophy. And you cannot decouple the market economy from the free society. And that concept has been falsified. And it has been falsified by Hayek and his pupils himself. His disciples of the Chicago School of Economics around the famous economist Milton Friedman, namely had designed the economic reform politics of the Pinochet regime in Chile in the 1970s. And later in an interview from 1981 with a Chilean pro-Pinochet newspaper, Hayek supported this move and said the above quote. I have it here in German, translated into English. It says, "Personally, I would prefer a liberal dictator," so like Pinochet, who is an economic liberal, of course not a societal liberal, over a democratic government that lacks economic liberalism, yeah? Which was the previous socialist, democratic socialist government of Allende. So this is basically a new playbook that was first tried in Chile in the 1970s, that you can decouple free market liberalism from the open society. And this playbook was repeated by Putin. It's actually quite interesting when Putin was still a local politician in St. Petersburg in 1993 and visited Berlin here as part of a St. Petersburg delegation. He said in an interview that his model for a kind of rebuilding of Russia would be Pinochet's Chile. It's actually the Neue Deutschland newspaper, former communist East German newspaper, that recorded that quote in that time. And of course, we have the same proof of this equation of decoupling the open society from the free market economy in China since the economic reforms of Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s. And so it is not coincidental that the neo-reactionary influencers, theoreticians that I mentioned before, Curtis Yarvin, who is under the tutorship of Peter Thiel, and the originally British media philosopher Nick Land, see China and Deng Xiaoping as the role models for a transformation of Western society into a new form of an aristocratic rule, what they call neo-reaction. And of course, this is also true for the Trump administration, I think particularly now in its second term. If I simplify a little bit, we could say the first Trump term was the term of the populist alt-right and of the memers and of the trolls. And the second Trump term is that of the Silicon Valley oligarchs and of neo-reaction. And in 2016, these both tendencies, the populist and the elitist tendencies, coexisted, but now it very clearly becomes visible that the oligarchic tendency is prevailing. I think a problem we have here is that these new forms of the extreme right and of fascism are not well criticized with kind of classical critiques of fascism that very often were psychologizing or psychological, that basically were a critique of the authoritarian personality here in the early sociological research led by Adorno in the USA, or also by Klaus Teweleit and others in the 70s in Germany. I think while their analysis is very true for early 20th century militarist fascism, it is only partly working for the new right, or what I would call contemporary postmodern fascism. And the right book by Kadia Attia and Anselm Franke and Ana Teixeira Pinto, I think, goes into a kind of critique of that classical psychological critique of fascism. What is the difference between what I would call modernist versus postmodernist fascism? You can maybe even see it in this kind of political iconography. Early 20th century fascism was based on the narrative that politics and society can be fixed by modeling after the military and thus by militaristic leadership, whereas contemporary postmodern fascism is for a large part not as ostensibly militarist. There are exemptions such as the Philippines, Russia, Israel, but it's chiefly economist. It's based on the trope of the disruptive entrepreneur and the narrative that politics and society can be fixed by modeling it after corporate management. We also see that in a difference of visual culture. I mean, just touching upon this briefly, this is a fascist architectural design for Berlin from the 1930s versus alt-right, so-called fash wave memes that take the same visual language but kind of almost queer it or turn it into a kind of fascist camp. Of course, we had these kind of ambiguities in fascism for a long time, and this is an open question for me. So, for example, in 1930s German fascism, we had Gregor Strasser as you could say today, in today's terminology, a homo nationalist, a gay leader, who understood understood fascism as social populism with socialist elements in it. In the 2016 Trump campaign, we had Milo Yiannopoulos as an ostensibly queer gay influencer. Or in the Duterte campaign, we had SAS and a number of transgender pro-Duterte social media influencers. The question is, already with Milo Yiannopoulos, we see this person has been discarded. Gregor Strasser and the SA, they were killed immediately after Hitler took power. So for me, it is an open question to which degree contemporary fascism can sustain these elements, or whether they are just kind of useful idiots being used for taking power. We also have an ideological contradiction between ecofascism and accelerationism. Yeah? Where you could say we have opposite ideologies within even the contemporary fascist movements, the ones that want to accelerate technology versus the ones that want to relinquish technology and go back. This is a picture, by the way, of an eco-fascist farming community here in East Germany, 200 kilometers north of Berlin. So if you would map all these contradictions, then you would end up with something like this, and the map is probably not even complete. I think there are two takeaways, and this is how I want to conclude. Maybe it has been a kind of a postmodernist element, not only in contemporary fascism, but even in 20th century fascism, that it could sustain these contradictions to some degree. And as a politics of gaining hegemony by basically promising everything to everyone. Promising, for example, a return to nature to eco-fascists or industrial acceleration to industrialists at the same time. And that was already a critique that was done or made by Marxist theoreticians as early as in the 1920s and 1930s. And it's of course a critique that you could repeat today, but maybe you could say this critique is not really helpful because sustaining contradictions and being contradictory and working rather on a libidinal economy than on rational argument is just the strength of fascism. By having these contradictions within its movements, it can appeal better, and it is also less, how do you say, it is something that you can less actually grasp and nail down. It's like if you try to nail it down ideologically, it's like nailing down a pudding on the wall, as you would say in German. Yeah? That also makes me wonder whether we should, as I did now in my own lecture, actually speak about the extreme right, or whether it's not more correct to speak of fascism, both the postmodern and the 20th century modernist fascism, as extreme center. The idea that there is something like a common sense in the population, and there should be a dictatorship of this common sense. And this common sense comes from the center. It comes from what is considered in German you call it gesundes Volksempfinden, yeah, the sane sense of the common people. Yeah? That's a very centrist idea. That's not necessarily a right-wing idea. So we have these contradictions within fascism, both contemporary and 20th century as well. To wrap up, I used some terms in my presentation, such as libidinal economy. I could have also used the term patchwork of minorities that make up contemporary fascism. And I also used the term of postmodern or postmodernist fascism. And this was a deliberate choice. I've been leaning on the philosopher François Lyotard, he has fallen a little bit out of fashion. He was more popular in the 1980s and 1990s. But I think it's really worth rereading his books, because they were themselves attempts to cope analytically and philosophically with the subcultures that had emerged out of the 1968 student movement in France. And they defined postmodernity in the late 1970s as a condition of the end of grand ideological narratives, and in relation to language games as defined by the philosopher Wittgenstein. And I think this is something that we are dealing with again. The concept of the Nouvelle Droite, of the new right, has succeeded to create something like a 1968 movement on the extreme center, let's call it like this, or a fascist 1968 movement that works with these ideas of patchworks, of libidinal economies, and also of sustaining ideological contradictions within its own framework. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I should start here. Yeah. So I'm going to continue with the keynote and talk about the idea of the contradictory idea of an illiberal sex revolution, or is it even possible to think of something like that? So this whole conference on illiberalism made me also think about the very central role of gender and sexuality and how that becomes part of this quest for cultural hegemony. So these are the topics: the importance of conspiracy theories in any kind of right-wing movement or anti-gender movement. The conspiracy theories, I give it a special sort of sauce. Sexual revolution that is being mirrored from left to right and back, and what does that mean? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about AI and deepfakes. So yes, anti-gender movements have become very strange coalitions and alliances. They're really hard to understand because different types of organizations, different players become part of anti-gender movements, basically. And the way I've been studying this is in Belgium and the Netherlands. And that's also important to say because a lot of the world still keeps projecting a kind of sexual sophistication or emancipation onto specifically the Netherlands, not so much Belgium. Still, we have a lot of LGBTQ legislation, like one of the first countries that legalized same-sex marriage, Belgium, for instance. But so it's important to also understand that also in Belgium and the Netherlands, the game is sort of over, perhaps. And we are also entering this 1,000-year-old, new empire that was described yesterday by Bifo so well. and following the playbook of Orbán, Hungary's Viktor Orbán. And a central role in all that is an attack, a radical push for cultural hegemony against gender ideology. And I have to also acknowledge that I collaborated with students at Ghent University in these case studies. So we're talking about, you know, that these anti-gender movements attract different types of organizations that are often ideologically opposed to each other, and also conspiracy thinkers. So, for instance, there are conspiratorial alliances that mobilize against gender and are heavily focused on the problem of the sexualization of children. I mean, we heard about this yesterday too, that this is also an idea that Viktor Orbán keeps emphasizing. And this also comes from the QAnon conspiracy theory, of course, the idea that we are you know, facing global elites and global pedophile networks that will infiltrate cultural institutions and education and so on and so on. So you see this, for instance, in demonstrations against drag queens in the Netherlands. The idea, many different organizations rallied against drag queens because they sexualize children. Or, you know, there was a lot of mobilization in Belgium against the new sex education program, because the only thing the sex education program is doing is sexualizing children. It becomes a very dominant idea, and it works. It works. I mean, a lot of players find it indeed that this is what's going to happen. Or I myself did a case study about this genderkoek in Dutch, the genderbread cookie. But also, strangely enough, the far right argues that that educational tool to explain LGBTQ identity, somehow this cookie sexualizes children, almost literally. Like if children would be seeing that or loving that or eating that, they would get aroused. Yeah? So this is the powerful gender phantasm that we are dealing with, and Judith Butler wrote her book about anti-gender movements, Who's Afraid of Gender, and so it's not, gender has become something that, yeah, means weird stuff to people, so it's no longer a box to be ticked, it's no longer an academic concept, for surely not, but a phantasm. It collects and escalates a multitude of panics and so on into a single bundle, yeah? So what gender even means to people is changing very quickly, and maybe it is becoming this very toxic or negative phantasm. And so this is really something that is hard to counter, for instance, but I also have an example of it. So this is also already mentioned by Florian, Geert Wilders of the PVV. And he's a sort of pioneer in the lowlands of Belgium and the Netherlands for bringing up this anti-gender ideology. So maybe we can just listen to the clip. Yeah, thank you.
Krijgen kinderen op veel basisscholen les over de zogenaamde genderkoek. Leren ze op de basisschool over panseksuele en genderneutrale. En ik zeg, hou op met die ongein. Laat die kinderen met rust. Gun het een kind om kind te zijn. Willen jullie in deze stad en in Nederland meer of minder Marokkanen? Kiezer heeft gezegd, we zijn het zat, we zijn het spuugzat en wij willen. En daar gaan wij voor zorgen dat die Nederlander weer op één komt te staan.
So, thank you. So, edited by this TikTok star editor, Chazi, to become a very smooth edit between anti-gender rhetoric and you know, anti-migration, very radical anti-migration policies. It's the anti-migration policies for which he was elected, of course, and the government in the Netherlands has just fallen, actually, as a matter of fact. But gender was also the icing on the cake, and I think he's also a conspiracy thinker as well, specifically when it comes to the anti-migration idea of the Great Replacement. So this idea of gender being this toxic force, this very pervasive force, entered the Netherlands, and also Belgium. The Belgian far right really has been very influenced by Geert Wilders. And this is back to Judith Butler. How can we counter this? We can talk about this also after the panel. It's really not easy to counter a phantasm. Are you going to set up your own positive phantasms? It works on an emotional level. It works on a psychic level that is hard to argue with. It's not very rationalist. So this is I think even Butler presents this as a necessity to counter phantasms, also as something that is very hard to do. Yeah. To move on, I think if we are thinking about the illiberal sex evolution and the contradictions, we can think about the end goal. What is the end game of these, for instance, these ideas by Viktor Orbán or Geert Wilders? Keep in mind that they want to seemingly restore a very orderly and what I call boring heteropatriarchy. Yeah? So even if the quest for cultural hegemony and all the ideas and the books they're writing and the cultural methods, the digital cultures that according to Florian now have maybe changed a little bit again because moving away from meme cultures and using more like AI and algorithmic manipulation. But so the methods, so we're all ingrained in that through our platforms and so on, but the end goal is something so stalemate, right? Have you ever have you ever heard a far-right or an anti-gender person talk about the future in anything like an exciting way? Please let me know. I mean, maybe I cannot be convinced. It could be simply that, but it is true that they also don't seem to have a future. There seems to be a lack of a projection into the future. The TV series Handmaid's Tale, I don't have to explain this, maybe we've all seen this, but this is also an era, for instance, where people are no longer fertile. Yeah, this is the end of human procreation. And so we talked about that yesterday as maybe a kind of resistance that people refuse to procreate. And so the anti-gender movements are going to forcefully bring in methods of procreation, of course, such as the enslavement of women to procreate for other people who've all become infertile. That is the key idea. Maybe when this program came out, it was still far-fetched. And now, ooh, it's getting closer and closer, perhaps, yeah? So then also other ways in which the right wing and the left are maybe being a kind of fuzzy zone that we can no longer distinguish very well. So these are the texts I have been inspired by, like Florian Kramer's text about transgression and disruption running through these different movements. And also Naomi Klein's idea about end-time fascism as the new text about New World Order, in which also gender and sexuality would be, of course, highly controlled, a very kind of scary development, very oppressive. So transgressive and disruptive, maybe this is about a few years ago. This is Thierry Baudet, who was the kind of the key leaders of the Dutch alt-right or the new right. And he's a product of the manosphere, so he was very crucial in formulating anti-gender ideology. And then he was also like quirky, just a little bit like Milo. So he had his own moment of nudity activism that he wanted to get it all, so to speak, wanted to have sort of violent domination over women, but also show his own beautiful body. And then later on in the Netherlands, Thierry Baudet was sort of discarded. His party fell apart. And then, strangely enough, this older far-righter, Geert Wilders, who I just showed, sort of had a total comeback. Which reminds me of yesterday, of the talk by Bifo saying that fascism is supposed to be a movement of young people. But in reality, what we're getting is these old-timers that are having weird kind of comebacks. And I remember discussing this with Florian a few years ago, that we could not imagine Geert Wilders ever coming back. He was also ill and so on, but he did have this total comeback. But then also his government just collapsed since last 2 weeks as well. Oh yeah, intersectional. So the buzzword of left-wing activisms, often intersectional, the idea that you have to share your own grievances or your own identity, or look to make alliances with other types of grievances. What we found in the research about anti-gender movements is that it was also very intersectional, as a matter of fact. The roots of anti-gender movements are the fundamentalist Christians who were trying to control gender and sexuality in the United States. These are the roots, maybe 2 decades ago. Then the anti-gender movements went global. They are very strongly present in South America and Latin America, and in Europe, for instance, in Eastern Europe, as we know. But now recently they move away from the Christian background, and for instance in Belgium a lot of Muslims who are joining the anti-gender movements. They are supposed to be ideologically opposed to each other, right? And now they're joining hands all against gender. So Catholic, Muslim, far-right, but also again a lot of anti-vax and QAnon that really fired up these movements. So here's a kind of chart of the attacks on EVRAS. EVRAS is a sex education program in French-speaking Belgium and Brussels. So all these small players, sorry you can't read it very well, but they're small organizations, maybe 50% of it is conspiracy theories, and also some Christian fundamentalists, but also some powerful Muslim organizations and a rapper. They all rallied against the introduction of a new sex education program. The sex education program would make it mandatory for primary school to have 2 hours of sex education, and for secondary school to have 2 hours. So it was about 4 hours of mandatory sex education. Of course, it was about tolerance, for instance, for LGBTQ, for queer sexuality, but it was also critical, for instance, of hypersexualization of media, of pornography. It was a very level-headed program that was being proposed, I would say. Also unique. It's not like we already had something like that in Belgium. Not at all. It was sort of brand new. And then there were rallies in Brussels, street protests, as well as a lot of online activism. So not many people have heard about this. It was very aggressive. And for instance, this woman, Radia Oulebsir, who is an influencer, a Moroccan influencer, and makes little videos in her car. I'm not going to show it, but she just made a lot of videos arguing against EVRAS. And also in this video, for instance, she's saying that children should be taken out of school. So take your children away from these schools that are going to have sex education. So it's also anti-education in general. A rapper, Rof, who's a French rapper who joined the band, and he's a friend. He just kind of literally took over the QAnon rhetoric about quote-unquote demonic sex education in Belgium, and please keep it in Belgium, don't let it come to France. So how come this French rapper gets involved in this rhetoric? It beats me, yeah, but he, of course, is kind of well known, he has a following, and he pushed this idea ahead. And some schools, 4 public schools were set on fire in Wallonia, and 1 in Charleroi. So again, it's just pretty amazing that something like that could have happened in the supposedly progressive lowlands of EU. It topples over, so whatever this quest for cultural hegemony and the ideas about gender and sexuality becomes violent very quickly in regions of the EU that we don't think this is going to happen. Maybe this was also a temporary flare-up as we can conceive of it, and it actually is the case that EVRAS was introduced in the school, so the sex education program did make it. But if we think about the anti-gender movements and how they're organized, and I don't think it's going to go away either, and I have this slide to back that up. There's an organization in Brussels, the EPF, European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights, and they have been tracking the money flows of the anti-gender movements in the decade between 2009 and 2018. So you can see a lot of money sustains the movements also. for instance, a lot of money is coming from the USA, and it is also coming from Russia, for instance. This is very sensitive research, actually. A lot of people are unaware of it, but you can get this report online. The director of the EPF, Neil Datta is his name, and he is also sued right now for doing this research by Polish organizations. So I keep asking him when he's going to write his follow-up after 2018, but he's definitely had to also work in a more low-key manner. But anyway, this is also to show that we're not talking just about cultural ideas or cultural hegemony. There's an economy to it as well, unfortunately. Naomi Klein, I was also thinking of her and her ideas about conspiracy theorists and mirroring between maybe, you know, feminists like Naomi Watts and Naomi Klein, and how maybe older school feminists who believe in body politics and who want to protect women's identities and bodies also topple over quickly into conspiracy theory. So this book tracks this kind of quick transition. I think it's really disturbing. And we actually found that in our case studies, a lot of conspiracy theory thinking that gives fuel to the fire, primarily, yeah? Two more things. So one concept that I looked at was divine femininity, which is a kind of, you know, dualistic notion of gender that was popular in the 70s and 80s radical feminist movements, and, you know, also popular for the body artists and performance artists of that time, who made very beautiful works suggesting that their bodies have a certain power and a power to overthrow the patriarchy. Yeah? That idea is taken over by the conspirituality movement people, the conspiracy theorists who want to reclaim spirituality. And you can also see that they do have ideas in common. Yeah? So the trying to preserve the pure body, the fear that the body is being contaminated is so strong. And of course, I think we all have this fear, so to speak, with the contemporary environmental problems and new drugs and so on. It is very hard to know what goes on with our bodies, right? Or fighting big pharma. This is something that the left and the right certainly has in common. But then the other ideas, like returning to sociobiology or the destruction of gender queerness, that is very strongly present in the new definition of divine femininity. And it is a kind of far-right concept, as a matter of fact, if you dig deeper into it. Although if you're going to interview people who believe in divine femininity or tradwives, they will deny it, yeah? They also always deny, they say we are not far-right. So it becomes confusing, yeah, to know what they actually think. And then I'll end with my favorite topic, pornography. So some of us here, also Florian Kramer and Tatiana, we all followed the movement of the DIY porn for the last 20 years, how it came about, became transgressive, intersectional, was very invested in queer and arts forms. And then after so many years, we have deepfake porn. And deepfake porn is part of the quest for cultural hegemony by the anti-gender networks and the far right. Yeah? So deepfake porn is sort of the toppling over of the idea of DIY porn. Deepfake porn is everything that DIY porn was supposed to be, but put on its head. It's basically a hate pornography. It's non-consensual. It's stealing the facial data, usually of activists like Greta Thunberg, or public figures, is stealing their facial information and putting it into porn movies, not to make an exciting porn movie or an arousing porn movie, but to make one to really bully these people or threaten them. And it's very powerful. Yeah? So, I mean, if movies like that circulate online, it may really be very painful for you personally or for your career, as a matter of fact. So maybe this question is, why is this deepfake porn stuff happening? if the far right is so concerned with, sexual emancipation, if they're so anti-porn or so anti-sexual enjoyment, why are they making their own kind of porn, right? This is the biggest contradiction, actually. So they're completely fractured also in what they are trying to do. So not to say that, Geert Wilders is sitting at home making deepfake porn, but in this bubble, this network that I showed you of this weird coalition, there's definitely those people like the manosphere people or the incels, the haters, who are using the latest methods of hate speech to fuck over some famous feminists or some public figures. So it's definitely part of the, the cultural quest for hegemony, I would say, yeah? So, yeah, why is this happening? And for me, this is really super sad that also porn can be manipulated that way, or erotica, that it can solely become an instrument of hatred. So in that sense, we need to reclaim it again. We need to mirror it again, I think, yeah? Or keep going with the consensual erotica and porn cultures that have been built here in the last 20, 30 years. So, and one artist who I want to mention is Arvita Bystrom, who has been doing just that. So she makes deepfake porn of herself, yeah? So yesterday we talked about Donna Haraway, for instance, and cyberfeminism. So this whole idea that we need to keep using these technologies in positive ways or to make new type of, cyborg type critters or creatures is still really important. Yeah, you can not really surrender that, but I think we are running the danger of that happening now. I mean, who still wants to use AI? I'm really curious to see what the next speaker is also going to say about it. Who still wants to use AI? Who still wants to use deepfake? So Arvita Bystrom is doing it. She's deepfaking herself into porn and selling it to people and reflecting on it. I think that's great. I wish more people would be able to do that, actually. Or this project, the Zizi Show, maybe we can just quickly end with this clip of also a way of redeeming deepfake tech. Yeah.
Please welcome to the stage your host for the evening, the world's first deepfake drag act, Zizi.
Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome. Fremde, étranger, stranger. Glücklich zu sehen, just vis enchanté. Happy to see you, bleibe reste stay. Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome im cabaret, au cabaret, to cabaret.
Okay, so just a little clip from this deepfake drag queen, deepfaking drag queens, and so he wants to build his own queer body and queer identity, drag identity, and he works consensually with people who become part of this composite. So what I like about this is exactly this composite. It's actually a bit hard to look at. It's not exactly beautiful because it's just falls. It's very much like Lyotard, right? Like Lyotard. Postmodern body image that can be anything and everything, but is also multiracial, for instance, and different body types. And so I think that's also Jake Ellis does a lot of this work. You can look him up on YouTube. So here comes my conclusion. So yeah, we are actually moving towards a very conservative, ultra-conservative new world. The EPF that I mentioned before wrote a new report about this. You can also find that online. This is about Trump, actually. This is about Trump's idea of the New World Order and how it affects sexuality and gender. So you can see an alternative global framework with all these different apps. And wow, like they give it these sexy names like Teen Star. Teen Star is for abstinence education. I'm really finished. So the last thing I'll say is FAM. The FAM app is for natural family planning. So to get back to the idea of procreating as quickly as possible, there's now an app, yeah, that will get you there. And it is already being used. These apps are already being used in some countries and will be coming to you. So I do think that this is totally ludicrous. Is this going to happen? I don't know. Maybe, I think we don't know. So let's discuss together if this kind of future is really going to happen or this is a total big joke. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Florian and Katrin. And now we start the discussion. And I'm very happy, actually, to have the combination of your two presentations, because I think that as we saw, this new right is taking different phases, different phenomena, and different application also in our physical life. I think one of our mission, perhaps, is also to bring more clarity. And so this would be my first question, because you both also spoke about the concept of hegemony, and I find it very important because, you know, in the past, often this discussion was also taken by leftist movements. Even at the beginning of 2000, there was a lot of this idea of the hegemony of the multitude. And now we saw that has been appropriated together with many other things. Maybe we should question even the idea of hegemony since the start, if it was actually making sense as a form of resistance or not. We even spoke a lot about disruption. I have to say now they even appropriated the title and the name of this organization as well. So with this definition of this padding that you have to nail on the wall, I didn't know this in German, interesting. How can you even confront something like that? Is it possible to speak about resistance, and how do we even deal with the idea of resistance if we then see that they are creating a form of destructive hegemony? So who wants to start?
Katrin, I really like the term you used in your presentation of the toppling. And yeah, the toppling over. And I think that is the core of the hegemony strategy, that you make people your allies who might not even be ideologically on your side. So, for example, you showed this example of the protest against the drag queen reading to children. It was in Rotterdam. I was there at the counter demonstration, and the demonstration against the drag queens had actually been organized by TERF feminists. Yeah? So TERF feminists who are being toppled are one example. Eco-fascists are another example. When we, for example, looked at you also mentioned that the anti-corona demonstrations here in Berlin, you saw the people and you thought, yeah, they're old hippies. And they're exactly the people who were like the core milieu of the Green Party when it emerged in the 1970s, mostly coming from anthroposophy. And anthroposophy had some elements that could be pulled over. And I think so maybe the point is not how to nail the pudding, but how to kind of create counter forces against the toppling. Yeah. So I think that the power politics is exactly at the margins, where some other social movement is basically pulled over. Yeah? It can be Muslims, it can be traditional feminists, it can be ecologists, and that is exactly, I think, where a counter-politics needs to intervene, to kind of, I don't know, counter-toppling. I don't know how to call it.
What do you think, Katrin?
Counter-toppling. So, sorry, can you give an example? I need a little more.
Yeah.
Because I'm a little bit lost what that could mean.
Yes. for example, if you look at the beginning of the ecological political movement in the 1970s, you could say back then that was also a hegemony strategy of the political left. Because a lot of the people who were in this original radical ecologist milieu, you could also say that they were borderline eco-fascists. And they were kind of pulled over. You know? Also, for example, the peace demonstrations in the 1980s against nuclear armament. So that was an example where you could say the political left had an hegemonic toppling operation that pulled over people who were not necessarily in the ideological camp. And now we're seeing the same happen, the same playbook being played by the extreme right. And maybe it is a playbook that needs to be played. Maybe any kind of movement needs to have, let's say, these kind of attractors at its borders.
But I also think that it is also just, I don't know, I'm sorry that it's very hard for me to suggest modes of resistance. I was very affected by Bifo's speech yesterday, actually, those of you who were here. His pessimism, right? And his whole kind of notion of impotence, the aging, collapsing Western world as impotence. So I just find it a bit hard to think of that you would then just go into where these margins are located and try to win them back over or something. Yeah, so I think it's also maybe something that is too fabricated, an idea. So I think sometimes left-wing, the radical left, or in Belgium, for instance, the radical left is very intersectional, right? So they try to be feminist, they try to be queer, they try to have migrant-friendly policies. They're really doing all that. And maybe what I mean is that is just still a more rationalist way of thinking, and it's very fabricated in a way too, yeah? So what needs to maybe come about is a kind of coexistence that is more effective, I would say, yeah? So I think that a kind of immersion where people can appreciate each other in different ways simply, yeah? That's what I think, and that's why AI is so dangerous, I think, frankly.
So also to clarify a bit for the public, do you think that this counter reaction, or maybe let's not call it reaction, but counter proposal to the hegemony would then be part of distributed processes and realities among smaller communities? Because how do you countertop this hegemony, you know, if something is very difficult to grasp? Yesterday, for example, we spoke about solidarity that also comes from individual, from people that self-organize. How do you think, how do you see it concretely?
Well, I'm sorry that I'm just focusing a lot on sexuality and gender as its own realm, let's say, right? So I think that this movement, for instance, this positive cultural phenomena that include encounters, multicultural encounters, intersectional activism, queer bodies, disabled bodies. We already have all that, right? That's been already surrounding us. So we need to be just getting immersed in that more again. This is what I really think, yeah? I think that the conspiracy theorist people that, in my opinion, are taking over a bit, I do think they feel very scared of this kind of immersion. They are really shielding themselves from the world, so to speak. So this shielding, I think it is very dangerous, perhaps, or whatever. This is where maybe we disagree with the Klaus Teweleit notion of fascism as the shielded personality, the person who wraps himself in a shield and becomes unable to, you know, and it's a masculine concept of identity, and becomes unable to feminize or is afraid that encounters with beautiful women would destroy the shield, yeah? I do think that is what the conspiracy theorist people kind of, you know, I think that's what drives them, actually. Yeah, the idea that you can shield yourself, or that you need to shield yourself, and this is what I do see happening also with technology. Technology can shield you also very powerfully, and so I do think maybe this is very simple or naive. I do think that we can get away from that again and get immersed in different types of materialities and loving and so on, but needs to be nurtured also.
Yeah. So in the sense I connect with this reflection because from what you are saying, also I interpret as a lot of reaction because of fear. So many of these ideologies are also coming from the fear of diversity, the fear of something that is not known. For example, in the past year at the Disruption Lab, we have a great keynote from Daryl Davis, a black American musician that started to befriend the Ku Klux Klan, and he was showing that a big part of their thinking was rooted in fear. And so, Florian, I wanted to ask you, you also spoke about this transition between like a more transgressive thoughts and way of thinking that was involving also a lot of experimental groups on the internet, even on 4chan, and then this new right became more and more oppressive and conservative. And do you think we are still witnessing a coexistence of opposition, so it's actually not a development, or instead there is a transformation from one situation to another? And if this is the case, what's the benefit of looking so repressive?
Well, the thing is that the repressive discourse itself can be transgressive, as you showed with the deep fake porn. Yeah? And that is maybe a new quality. So you can allow transgression if it goes into a certain way or if it has a certain ideological direction. And that was already true of the 4chan troll alt-right in the 2015s. And that was also pronouncedly anti-feminist and did similar operations, only that they didn't have AI tools back then. So I think the discourse we have is like, transgression as a privilege, transgression as something that you can do if you are included, and that is not allowed if you are excluded. So basically what is being done with a hegemony strategy is to define an in-group and say, within this in-group, you can be transgressive. You can be Elon Musk, who is high on ketamine and running a ministry. And you can even be open about that, right? And there is also, it can have certain campy qualities. Yeah? You wear funny base caps, etc., while you're running this ministry, etc. I would say that this is a new quality, but the thing is that it's also, it's an exhibition of a privilege. The fact that you can be transgressive is a sign of power. Yeah? It's almost like the Mad King. Yeah? And also Donald Trump is the best example of the Mad King. It's basically, for those of you who know it, Ubu Roi by Jarry as the perfect reenactment. But I think the critique, or the weakness of the critique from liberals, from the left, is to say, oh, he's a Mad King. Today there was an anti-fascist manifesto published in several European newspapers, signed by some Nobel Prize winners, and it did exactly the same mistake. Yeah? It doesn't help to call out the Mad King as a Mad King, because actually the fact that the Mad King is mad is a sign of liberation, and is a sign of privilege, and is a sign of power. And this is, I think, what we need to deal with.
So it's a transgression of the privilege and of the rich.
Yes, but the promise is you can be part of that, You don't need to be rich. You can be your little internet troll in your garage, and you're making the deep fake porn of Greta Thunberg, and then you will be part of us. You will be,
And of course, it is very attractive to observe. even Trump. I mean, yeah, so this is indeed also the problem, right? So what do people even think about maybe that, what is the future, what kind of future would they have in mind, or where is this all going? I mean, I think there's a lot of distraction in this system that, yeah, in this pointing out of the transgressive clownishness of the new rulers endlessly. So, yeah, I don't know. I think it's the media, the role of the media, the role of social media. And I also think you asked me before, Transjara, about these tech millionaires. You asked me, are they really afraid of gender? That was actually a good question, I thought. Sorry,
I was actually thinking to ask.
Sorry, my mind is a little bit fried right now.
This is also our conversation that we have among us.
So I don't think they are, maybe. I really don't think they're actually afraid of gender.
By these news that, in a sense, are even contradicting each other. We also saw, Elon Musk and Donald Trump's like best friend. And, after they became enemy, they were like going against each other. Now, I mean, I don't know how much friend they are, but it's a constant over-contradiction of the previous thing, and I believe this is also a political strategy to acquire more power.
It's rule through chaos, and I would say that is a libertarian element of the contemporary fascism, whereas the promise of 20th century fascism was rule through order. If you can make such a binary distinction, of course, I mean, you have to differentiate, and it's not that clear-cut if you look closer, but I think in the big lines, that's the difference. And that's also why so many people fail to see it, yeah? Because they say, but there is no man in a uniform shouting and making Hitler salutes, so it's not fascism. But I think that's really a problem of both the image of fascism that has been created through popular culture, through movies, etc. But I would also say, yeah, also through the analysis, let's say psychological analysis of fascism as this kind of authoritarian leadership paradigm.
So shall we open to the audience? There is already a question over there.
Yes, hello. Thank you. I mean, thank you so much for discussing this. I wanted to maybe get back, because I thought it was very interesting to be discussing this kind of strange alliances and a strange coalition that you were mentioning. And then, Tatiana, you were talking, and for me it's really connected to the appropriation as well. I feel that sometimes it's almost a little bit too easy to say, well, we agree, we have the bad guys, they're on the right, they're fascist, and you're discussing how we can fight against them. Okay, all fine. What I'm concerned about, which I feel it's even more perplexing and threatening, is how you see those tendencies. So it could be like, to take your example, like gender policies. How these anti-gender people are not necessarily coming from where you would expect them to be coming from. And I could give a lot of examples of how those people feel they are fighting hegemony. They feel they're fighting some kind of fascism. They feel they're resisting. So this is where it becomes like very, I would say, confusing, perplexing, vexing, and really complicated. And I'm going to give you a single example, because I feel we talk about very general things, and maybe I'm going to bring something a little different. But I live here. I know people, for example, and I'm bringing something we're not talking about, but for example, typical lefty intersectional thing for me as a French person, which would be to be basically involved with a ceasefire in Palestine, for example, and being around a lot of people who've been resisting Germany government, and trying to oppose some kind of against conformism or against some kind of politics. I found out, and I realized that among those people, which were pro-immigration, pro-Palestine, which I see as something positive, obviously. But a lot of them were actually overlapping with what you were talking about, the anti-COVID thing. Anti-COVID, anti-lockdown. There are a lot of, for example, anti-vax people, and you know, I'm a journalist, I'm not even judgmental when I'm saying this. But I'm saying it's very complicated. And I was very, very surprised to be talking with people who are amazing people, and they're doing so much for like integration and immigration, and suddenly they start telling me about the fascism of gender politics and sexual education, you know, in the school of their children. And they have thousands of examples, and they feel they're resisting the state, you know. They don't feel that they're being, as you said, and I'm not even sure they're far right. I mean, I don't know what you defined as far right. So what I'm trying to say, I don't have an answer, but I think things are so complicated, are getting so complicated, because on the one hand, you have this super polarized society. On the other hand, you have this kind of very fluid, speaking about gender, very fluid contours of things. And intersectionality, you know, I don't know whether you call it intersectional, but it goes all over the place. And so I guess I'm bringing a bit more chaos into the chaos here, and I don't know. But I think this is something that, for me, on my side as a journalist and working with a lot of people, I'm endlessly surprised about, endlessly perplexed about, and I really don't know where it's going and what to do about it.
Sorry, I don't know. No, I think it's a very powerful testimony. I do not know what to say, actually. I mean, so I think for me, I have a kind of strong revulsion of anti-vaxxers, actually, myself. So if I would be in your situation and would meet these kind of people who are then aligned with your politics somehow, I don't know how I would react to them. I would be biased to them. Because also, like, you know, yeah, because of their whole misinformation campaign, they're strong, you know. In my case study, they were responsible for completely rendering gender totally meaningless, as a matter of fact, right? So to them, gender doesn't mean actually anything anymore in a way. So it's quite dangerous. So it makes me very angry. These anti-vaxxers make me super angry. But you're right. What if they are in your group, right? And also because I also feel divided. I feel torn, because one thing that they also have in common with us maybe is indeed a need for a body politics, right? As opposed to rational politics that is based on debate or ideas or words, yeah, or discourse. So we are also approaching the end of discourse era, right? So in that sense, we need to find other languages, and that's what they're also doing in a way, right? So it is complicated. Sorry that I feel so fractured about this. Yeah. Okay.
You want to add something?
Maybe I can add an autobiographical note, because I grew up here in Berlin, actually, when it was still West Berlin before the fall of the wall in the 1980s. And yeah, sorry, I grew up here in Berlin in the 1980s before the fall of the wall, when this was still West Berlin. Actually, I first came here into this room in 1984 to see a performance by Tödliche Doris. And back then, you know, in my high school, the cool kids, the post-punk kids, the more alternative kids, most of them were extreme right. It already happened back then, and they were also the ones. Their leaders were the ones who went then into East Berlin in 1989 to build up the fascist squads and the 1990s East German neo-Nazi movement. Mostly had West German leaders who came out of these kind of subcultures. And for example, here in Berlin, in Kreuzberg, there was a hardcore punk record label which in the early 1980s brought out the first samplers, LP samplers of hardcore punk, German hardcore punk music, called, I think it was called Soundtracks zum Untergang, Soundtracks to the Collapse. And the first volume of the record was with a German punk band Slime, whose songs you can hear on any radical left-wing demonstration until today. And the second volume was with Böse Onkels, the skinhead bands, which became the iconic neo-fascist band back then. So I think the seeds of that confusion, especially in countercultures, they go a long way. And you could even go further back into the 1960s. I stop here, sorry, I don't want to talk too long.
Yeah, in a sense also this goes back to also what we experienced during the pandemic, that became very confusing to see the hippie together with the people voting AfD. So, but as I say, I think they are really also playing with that and confusing us in a sense, because then how do you create your form of resistance also when you see that the people that before you were thinking, you know, were part of your left-wing thinking, then are suddenly saying things also on Facebook that are really, completely on the right, you know?
So I think the idea that I focused on about this fear of children being raped or misused, abused, is something that can easily trigger everyone, right? Everyone across the board. That's also why I focus on it, because it has a very huge impact on young people's idea of sexuality. So in Belgium, they were having, during these election times, I did a case study, they were having TV programs for youth, so youth could come in the studio and they would have debates about difficult political issues. And so they were kind of literally introducing these ideas uncritically about gender and sexuality. So the young people were saying on TV that they're really scared that their young sisters, you know, were going to be, raped. So that it had worked. These ideas were really working. So, of course, everybody is going to uncritically take this kind of idea over, right? It's in the 90s in the USA, there was completely, the huge culture wars were always also centering on the same idea, right? That the internet would sexualize children. So there were a lot of parties rallying against internet communication altogether, actually, because of this idea, for instance. It is a very powerful type of misinformation. It's so, I'm glad I can talk about it in this way without being attacked. Thank you.
Let's see if there is another question. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for the discussion. It's been very, very interesting. I'm going to pick up a little on what the first reflection between you was on the sort of toppling, counter-toppling, which I found also exciting, because I was thinking on, I think ostensibly a lot of these practices and events on sort of building this right-wing cultural hegemony happens online, right? But in these online spaces, there's also oftentimes just context collapse. People that participate in these activities or that consume certain content or, become part of these pipelines are oftentimes quite unaware of what they're participating in until it's maybe too late. They might not ever become radicalized, but they might just never see the harms of the practices that they do, right? So I think my question was, in idealizing this sort of fighting politics in the frontier, and also, again, these strange coalitions of people that we might find, how do we do it, considering that so much of it is, I think, sort of sprouts organically from this, because people just, in the online space come into these very seemingly innocuous practices that then become a major tool for the right to, espouse their rhetoric and to do whatever they need to do. And I think in general, just how do we fight in a different playing field, because it feels that the online space is itself just contaminated to always favor these things. I don't think organically things that are maybe left-wing or progressive are going to really show up and become, the hegemony. Also, I think in general we need to, I don't know, I'm looking at what we're discussing, and the language is a lot of fighting back, because it is a moment of fighting back, but at some point we have to figure out how to lead, being in the defense often means that we take always a reactionary step or a reaction and never the first action, and it's, thanks.
Yeah, I think you address, I must say, there were some words I didn't understand because of the echo, but what I understood, I think, is a really important point. Maybe the way of getting out of the, let's say, the kind of reactionary trap, maybe we could call it like this, yeah? So basically what any kind of cultural hegemony operation does, it brings the opponent into the defensive, is to offer an alternative vision. And that's also what you mentioned in your talk. Maybe that's the most powerful critique that can be made. You said, in all these anti-gender politics, there is no vision. Yeah, its grounds are completely dystopian. Yeah, yes, it's also what Naomi Klein wrote in her piece of how did she call it? End-time fascism. Yeah, there is only an apocalyptic vision, but the question is, what kind of narrative can you offer that is not just defensive? Yeah, so like the so-called anti-fascist manifesto that was published today that I quoted earlier, is completely defensive. It says we have to defend our institutions, we have to defend rational arguments, we have to defend evidence. Yeah, if you are that defensive, then and people say for good reasons, yeah, but sorry, your system hasn't worked for us. It really sucks. Yeah, you have brought us into a kind of dystopian future, and if for example, the extreme right or the extreme center, as I would call them, says, fuck climate justice, we just ignore it, we have a better life, if we keep living like it is. This might be very cynical, but it actually, is a prospect of a better life. This is why it works. This is also why anti-vax works. Well, fuck this politics. Let's forget about the pandemic. It's just a fabrication. We can have a better life. So what kind of better life can you promise? Yeah? I think that is the kind of crucial question for any kind of counter-politics that is not just reactionary or defensive.
I just have another related idea, maybe. I think you're also mentioning that sometimes people join a cult or maybe a club, and then it's a sort of tentative, or they fall into it. Maybe an example would be the manosphere. Yeah, like a lot of young men are very influenced by that. It is growing, I think, the influence of Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson. Giving a talk in the Netherlands of Belgium would really definitely get a mass audience. So there's definitely happening, right? So it's meta-politics, right? Like he explained, it's just meta-politics. What does it actually mean, yeah? These kind of dodgy ideas of Jordan Peterson. The ideas themselves don't make any sense, but they attract this youth, and a lot of them are also into body cultures and fitness, which is fine, right? There's nothing wrong with that as such. I think it's funny that in Belgium, I read about this as now a left-wing manosphere. So they wanna do what what Florian proposed, which is to propose something better, which is you can have your manosphere, but we're going to decouple it from far-right ideas. Yeah. So these are maybe similar ways in which young men can have fitness or can have weekends together about masculinity, sharing about masculinity, basically. Maybe that is an example. I don't know. I have not gone deeply into what they're actually doing, but I thought it was interesting as a way to maybe indeed not run away from it, but also realize a lot of people are actually right there. So maybe it's time to go there and do something with it. Yeah.
Yeah, but also because I would say that the better life they are proposing is kind of fake, because at the end they are also planning to go to Mars. So, you know, there is the ultimate escape for them that is real, and is also pretty much part of a vision of the world that is kind of fascist, if you want. You know, let's abandon humanity, let's become the superhuman, also going back to the discourse of transhumanism that proved to be, you know, the vision of the world that they want, while in the 90s, many people in our scene also thought that transhumanism was very progressive. So actually, at the end, they are escaping this world. And I agree that what we need to do maybe is to counter this escape with something that is a positive vision of the future, because at the end, they don't have a positive vision of the future.
And maybe to say something positive about this, if I look at the kind of intellectual history of Berlin and the kind of initiatives that also existed since the 1990s on new media, on net art. I'm looking at Inke, for example. I think Berlin and Germany back then was maybe the one place in the West where transhumanism was not welcome. From the beginning on, because if you were growing up here in this German system, if you were kind of educated with the history of fascism, it struck you as fascist ideas, as kind of perverted Nietzscheanism from the beginning on. And that was a critique I think that many people had back then, or at least where they said, we stay clear of that, we don't want it. I cannot recall any conference, for example, of what then Micro organized, the Micro lounges, where the transhumanists were involved. And maybe that is also a necessary labor to do, a kind of self-critical labor, to go back into these things. Why could this happen? Why could it happen that some parts of our discourse were not critical of transhumanism in that time? Why didn't we see the problem in anti-vax and in certain strands of ecologism? I think that kind of retroactive or critical work also needs to be done. And I think, and now maybe I'm now saying something that will offend some people, but I think this also applies to the currently, I work at an art school, very fashionable philosophy of posthumanism. Which, you know, is a very legitimate ecologist critical philosophy about human centrism, but I think since the beginning on, since the 1990s, it's also had this kind of problematic element of romanticizing technology as the kind of non-human other that we're collaborating with, etc., etc. So this is also where there's a contemporary discourse where we need to be critical.
And I would say, since we're also speaking about the virtual world, maybe we ask to the online audience if there is a question. We need the mic. Yeah.
Okay. I think we kind of touched on this topic already, but maybe you can go a little further. This question is for Florian. How can countercultural forms reclaim space without mimicking the populist tools of the right?
The most difficult question.
Oh, this is really difficult. I mean, maybe my counter question would be, is counterculture a value in itself? My argument would be counterculture has always been both. Fascism has always been part of counterculture. Counterculture is not a value in itself. The question, also the word itself, counterculture, says it's just a reaction to something. It's not a value in itself. And that is not to dismiss the concept of counterculture. I think it's very important. It's also something that I'm very involved in and study. But I think there needs to be more critical work to realize that terms such as counterculture, you mentioned multitude, patchwork of minorities, that they are basically kind of empty shells or empty vessels that can be filled with all kinds of ideologies. And maybe that this kind of critical work was insufficiently done in the past.
Maybe instead of counterculture, we call it grassroots culture.
That's the same. You know, we do have fascist grassroots culture very much. I mean, they're really good at grassroots culture, I must say.
You want to add something? No. I would say we are done, but maybe I still want to give an option if there is a last question from our audience, if there is something still missing. Yes, there is one.
Hi. I'm not sure there is something missing, but I think, I just want you first to make a comment because I think the pro-Palestine movement was brought into question by your comments earlier, and I have to say that is not my experience, and I see anti-gender and anti-vax positions coming actually from the anti-Deutsche movement and not from the pro-Palestinian or Palestinian movement, where I see a lot of solidarity and the intersectionality. So that's my comment, because I didn't want to walk away from this without saying this. And then it also seems to me between yesterday and today that there is a little bit of this conversation about should we still call it fascism? Is it fascism? Is it post-fascism? What do we call these things? But I also think that, for example, Bell Hooks calls it the white supremacist, colonial patriarchy. And I think that already contains the concept of fascism in it. And maybe we spend a lot of time thinking about, what are names, but we already have, the names.
I would tentatively agree, but then my question would be, how do we deal with regimes such as Duterte in the Philippines or Modi in India? So that there's a problem.
Because they want, proximity to whiteness. That is very clear to me. That is, how India is moving, is now the biggest fan of Israel. It's not, because they really believe that, Israel cares for India. It's just that they use the same concept of ethno-nationalism and, the desire, in a way, to be, on the ladder as close to, the white supremacists as possible. So again, it's a use. It's not an identifying themselves with it. I don't know if that makes sense.
And I think ethno-nationalism is a really good a term that we didn't bring in, and that pretty much nails it. And that also describes the contradictions, because, of course, if every nation has their own ethno-nationalism and they pretend to be the same movement, how can this work? It's a recipe for disaster.
Okay, so I think we are over with our time, and I really want to thank Florian Cramen and Katrin Jacobs for this great keynote. Thank you so much. And I want to invite the audience, both online and here at the venue, to come back in 20 minutes. We will have a panel in which we discuss generative AI, political shadow campaign, and weaponized language, that will start with a lecture performance by Donatella Della Ratta, in which we will touch also the discourse of the not yet realized from bringing scenery from Palestine to Trump's America. So please come back, and we will go on with the program. Thank you so much. Thanks.